Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about some of the territorial change of the area of Russia and some of the history of it, including what was called the Russian Empire, which later became the Soviet Union and is now the country of Russia and a collection of nearby countries. So let's start with the Russian Empire. And this is a figure that shows the Russian Empire. Kind of the green line is the extent of it over time, but it's a really huge area that encompasses Central Asia, Transcaucasia, as well as some countries in Eastern Europe, and at one time even Finland. So this is kind of expanded and shrunken over time. And I want to highlight this area here called the Grand Duchy of Moscow. And one thing I want to highlight is the Grand Duchy of Moscow, sort of the original kingdom that Russia developed out of, was an area that was landlocked in Eastern Europe. So again, we're on the European side here. This is sort of a kingdom that was landlocked, and so they didn't have access to the ocean like many of the other European countries did. And one thing I want to highlight before we go on is how did this Duchy of Moscow expand into this massive territory that we see today? So the Russian Empire is what we call a land empire, that its expansion was by going into neighboring areas until it reached some sort of a defensible border, like the Caucasus Mountains or the deserts of Central Asia or the Pacific Ocean even, that it expanded, it hopped over area over area over area over time, and it's what we would call a land empire. And one part of that expansion was trying to find warm water seaports. So because the original Duchy of Moscow was landlocked, they wanted to project power in the world. So one thing they did is expand and build a new capital in St. Petersburg. So during the Russian Empire, their capital moved from Moscow here to St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg is an example of a forward capital. It's different than Brazil's forward capital, which is in the interior, meant to kind of an inward-looking forward capital, trying to unite the country. In the case of Russian Empire, it is moving the capital as an outward-looking move, trying to project power into other parts of Europe. So here's a closer view of that expansion. You start out with the original Duchy of Moscow, initially expanding into the area, near St. Petersburg, and then over time into Siberia and down into Central Asia and into Eastern Europe. And some of the videos that we'll post along with this kind of explains that part of this has to do with trying to find defensible borders. One thing, so Russia is a land empire, and just kind of an interesting comparison is that United States, and to a lesser extent Canada, are also land empires. So like Russia, the original 13 colonies expanded westward until they reached the defensible border of the Pacific Ocean in the United States. This is something we've learned about in school, the westward expansion of the United States. Part of that had to do with the Transcontinental Railroad. So this is a map showing the Transcontinental Railroad, which is meant to unite the country that's expanded to the west. And in Russia, you have something similar to the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States called the Trans-Siberian Railway. So this is a railroad much larger than the Transcontinental Railroad, built around generally the same time period, that was meant to connect the large country of Russia, the Russian Empire, from west to east. So while the United States were familiar with its westward expansion to the Pacific Ocean, around the same time period, the Russian Empire was experiencing an eastward expansion also to the Pacific Ocean. In fact, theirs expanded all the way to Alaska at one time, but they ended up selling Alaska to the United States. So in some ways, there are comparisons to the westward expansion of the United States to the eastward expansion of Russia the Russian Empire across Siberia. Now, just for contrast or comparison, the British, on the other hand, which were a small island country, projected sea power and developed an empire over the ocean. So all of these areas that are highlighted here at one time were part of the British Empire, which were controlled by a powerful navy of the island country of Great Britain. But Russia, the United States, expanded more over land than over ocean. And the Russian Empire ended in around the time of World War I, and what we call, and it's known as the Russian Revolution, but I'm going to call it the first Russian Revolution, because we can also call the breakup of the Soviet Union a second Russian Revolution. So what we call the Russian Revolution happened around World War I, 1917, and this caused the collapse of that Russian Empire, and in its place, it became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR for short, or commonly we just call it the Soviet Union. And between 1917 and 1922, the Soviet Union was formed, roughly in the same area as the original Russian Empire. So this is a map showing the Soviet Union, and the way it was put together, it was a set of semi-autonomous republics. So while the real power was in the Russian Republic, there were some other socialist republics like the Kazakh Republic, and the Uzbek Republic, Turkmen Republic, and so on. The Belarusian Republic, the Ukrainian Republic, Moldova. And one thing you may note about this is that these are all now independent countries that broke away when the Soviet Union collapsed. But during the Soviet era, they were separate republics that were all joined together, kind of like states in the United States in some way. And a couple of things about the Soviet Union is that, and this is true of the Russian Empire, but we'll highlight here is that this is not all one culture, especially when you get into Central Asia and the Caucasus regions. You're getting into different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different linguistic groups. And so it's not all one single unified culture, but yet it was held together across these vast territories. And another thing is that the Soviet Union was intended to be a federation. We've talked about federalism with Canada, the United States, where we have a central government, we have state or local or municipal governments. The idea was that power was going to be shared among these republics like the Kazakh Republic and the Ukrainian Republic. But in reality, Russia was such a dominant republic that it was the center of power throughout the Soviet period. And one way that Russia exerted that power was through a policy called Russification. And this actually started with the Russian Empire, but continued through the Soviet era. And the idea is that one way that Russia maintained control was by relocating Russians to the different republics and moving some of their population to other places. So by moving people around and replacing them with people who were ethnically Russian and spoke Russian, this helped solidify the control of Russia over its neighbors. And the result today is that there are still large minorities of Russians in some of the republics. So for example, we're going to take a closer look at Ukraine and see that, especially in eastern Ukraine, there are large pockets of Russian minorities today. Another aspect is economic, that the Soviet Union had what's called a command economy. This involves central planning of all economic activity. So in contrast to a capitalist system where individual corporations are making their own decisions and then together that collectively forms the economy, here the government is planning out where there's going to be factories, where there's going to be rail lines, where there's going to be infrastructure, where businesses are going to be located, that the government has more complete control over the economic activity of the country. And one effect of that is to spread manufacturing farther into the interior than it might otherwise be naturally. That private companies might not have chosen to put a factory deep in Siberia, but to try to unify the country and spread jobs around. The central planning of the government who's doing this command economy is able to kind of make decisions that might not make the best economic sense if you're a private company. Okay, so, and one part of the expansion of Russia, and this will be highlighted in some of the videos, is that it's responding to trying to be able to defend itself against land invasion. So it expands to the Caucasus Mountains and into Central Asian deserts and into the Pacific Ocean, the Tian Shan Mountains here in the south. And part of the reason for that expansion, let me highlight one other area, also into Eastern Europe, into the Northern European plain. And one reason for that is that Russia has had a history of land invasions. And I think one of the videos at least is going to highlight that with Napoleon in World War I, World War II, there have been a series of land invasions from Central Europe into Russia. The French, the Germans, twice. And they've attacked through the Northern European plain, or what the book calls the North European lowlands. Again, remember that those extend well into the European part of Russia. And because of that, Russia, for its own defense, has had a preference to try to control as much territory as it can between its heartland in Moscow and this area in Central Europe. So Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and now even Russia have made attempts to try to maintain as much control as they can over this area in Eastern Europe. And this kind of leads us into the Cold War era. So just to try to connect what's happening in World War II with what's happening in the Cold War, this is a figure, it's from Wikipedia, showing different stages of the war. And in this one, the areas in blue are the areas that are occupied by the Germans and their allies at the beginning of the war. So initially, the German and the other Axis powers have expanded deep into what was then the Soviet Union and have attacked through that corridor. However, the tide of the war turns later on. And now what's happening, we know the history more from our end with D-Day, the US invasion with its allies, and us pushing in from the West. But there's also a push from the Soviet Union from the East. So you have kind of two things going on here. You have the Western allies, the United States, the British, and so on, pushing in from the West. And you have the Russian, or the Soviet Union, excuse me, pushing in from the East into Germany. And at the end of the war, we begin the Cold War era, where now the Soviet Union is occupying much of Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. And at the same time, what's happening in Western Europe is the development of the Marshall Plan, the early European Union, development of NATO. And what that really is defending against is further expansion of the Soviet Union, which is now occupying much of Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. So we have the situation in Europe at the end of World War II, beginning of the Cold War, where you have the Soviet Union, along with what are called these satellite states in pink, which are really under the control of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, in blue here, you have the Western aligned countries, and essentially the NATO countries that are aligned with the United States. And so in the Cold War era, you really have a standoff between the Western European countries, backed up by the United States, and the Soviet Union, along with its aligned countries here in the East. And this division between them is what's known as the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is meant to symbolize that division between East and West. One last sort of side note about the Cold War era is that some of the terminology we use to describe different countries of different development levels actually is derived from this Cold War era. So the term third world country or first world country, like first world problems, actually comes from a description of who was aligned with who during the Cold War. And during the time, the NATO countries, or Western Europe, the United States and Canada, were described as the first world. The communist world was described as the second world. We don't use that term as much anymore. So Eastern Europe, along with the Soviet Union and China, they're described as the second world. And what are the non-aligned countries? In other words, countries that were not clearly part of one or the other, the rest of the world was described as the third world.